Hi, my name is Trish, and in this video, I'll be talking about all the books that I read in January and February. Now, 2022 was a bitch of a year for me, reading-wise. For anyone who's watched my previous video, you'll know that I read a phenomenal number of 14 books for the entire year. My reading slump definitely overstayed its welcome, but now we've had an amicable breakup, we've parted ways, and I'm doing a good job of moving on, evident in the fact that it's only February and I've already read 13 books. 13 books! I know those are rookie numbers for more seasoned hardcore readers, but for me that is nothing short of a miracle, a divine intervention, Jesus literally taking the wheel. If you cannot tell, I am very happy with my progress, and without further ado, here are the books that I've read so far. So first, we'll start with the books that I read in January. I consider January a cramming month. It's usually the time when I try to read all of the leftover books from last year. All but one of the books that I read in January were actually leftovers from last year. In fact, one of the books here even started way back in October and just finished in January of this year. And as I love saying as a procrastinator, better late than never. So the first book that I finished in January was Horror Store by Grady Hendrix, and I gave this book 3.75 stars. Horror Store is a reinvention of the haunted house story, only instead of it taking place in a house, it takes place in a furniture shop. And as a loyal suki sa Mandawi home, I really enjoy that concept. The description of the furniture shop in this book was so detailed that sometimes I felt like I was walking through it. The possibilities of having a haunted house set somewhere whose homeliness is just a facade is very interesting. There were unusual twists to familiar haunted house tropes, and I found that very fun to read. Scary, yes, but fun. It's like encountering Ronald McDonald on the street in the middle of the night. There's the excitement because it's the Ronald McDonald, but there's also the fear because it's Ronald McDonald on the street in the middle of the night. That being said, I do think that Grady Hendrix tapped into the possibilities of the horror in the story in a very shallow surface level. I think that the story could have incorporated the actual furniture shop more because it was practically a character in itself. I also didn't like the main character very much, which is not a surprise with Grady Hendrix books. He tends to write unlikable main characters. But when I'm rooting for the survival of the side characters more than the main character, I think that says something. I'm going to cap this review off with how much I love the publication of this book. I really like that they printed this book to emulate a furniture catalog. There were descriptions and illustrations of different furniture models, and they got stranger and darker as the story progressed. It was really fun and immersive. The next book that I finished in January was Sweet Bean Paste by Durian Tsukigawa, and I gave this book 4 stars. Sweet Bean Paste is a short, sweet story about a guy with a dead-end job and an old woman with a mysterious secret. These two form an unexpected friendship, and we follow them as they open up to each other more, touching each other's lives in a way that was so heartwarming and sad. Sweet Bean Paste was the first in a line of books with old people characters in them that I will be eventually reading throughout the next following weeks. So it really set the tone for how I feel about elderly main characters. And the jury is not good, guys. I get too attached way too quickly. Pabayin nyo na lang si Lola kasi Lolo, ako na lang ang sakit. Ako na lang ang sakit. To be completely dramatic. The pacing for this book was definitely slow, and if I'm being honest, the first half of the book was pretty dull. But once we get past the point where Tokue, the elderly main character's secret, is revealed, that's when things start picking up and the story becomes more emotionally charged. The storytelling was touching but not overly dramatic. It wasn't trying too hard to be sad, but it was definitely conscious of being a sad story. I think this is a perfect book to read for when you just want to feel things. And now for the first 5-star read of the year. Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. Cultish delves into the role of language in cultish behavior and how cults and its many harmful and or more well-intentioned iterations use it as currency to bring people in. It's very in-depth, very detailed, and it covers a scope larger than I could ever have imagined. It talks about how early evangelical rhetoric influenced today's multi-level marketing scripts and principles. Like, I never would have imagined that evangelical Christianity would have had a hand in how Tupperware and Avon operates. But here we are. The book also debunked the common misunderstanding that cultish behavior and recruitment has anything to do with brainwashing, something that I was guilty of, especially during the recent tumultuous election here in the Philippines. The book also talks about how we have this very negative connotation of cults, but we engage in cultish behavior and language in our everyday lives, and we're not even aware of it. We're all basically that video of that dog shaking hands with people to close deals, but we don't actually know what we're shaking about.
However, Kat pointed out that I'm often unaware of what I'm shaking on. For example, when I shook the neighbor's hand this morning, I have no clue what I agreed to. None. Kat says this is how the devil buys souls. I will pee on the bed for comfort.
And while I enjoyed the multitude of layers about the topic, what I really liked the most about this book was how accessible it was to read and consume. Amanda Montell's writing is very easy to follow, and I think that's an important thing to consider, especially when the book's main goal is to explain things. I found Cultish to be an enjoyable and educational read. It was relevant for me because I could pinpoint recent events happening around me and in my personal life that were being talked about in the book. So if you're planning to add more nonfiction to your TBR, might I recommend this one? The next book that I finished in January was Hide by Kirsten White, and I gave this book 4.25 stars. Now this is actually the one book that I started and finished in January. Hide is about a group of strangers who are invited to join this reality show where they have to play hide and seek in a decrepit amusement park for 1 week. Pretty straightforward until strange things start happening and they disappear one by one. So it's like Survivor, but no one actually survives. I read Kirsten White's previous books, loved them, and this was her first foray into adult horror. I also really enjoyed reading this book. In fact, I finished it in a couple of days. So it pains me to have to say this because I do not want to be that bitch. But I'm gonna have to be that bitch for this video. This book did not feel like an adult horror to me. In my opinion, it read very young adult in terms of tone, storytelling, and atmosphere. There are definitely some differences between Hyde and Kirsten White's previous YA books, like The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, for example. I just don't think they were able to fully shake off the young adult vibe just yet. That being said, I really did have a good time reading Hyde. I liked how Kirsten White described the scary scenes in this book. They never directly described the scene when something bad was happening. Instead, they write about it after the fact. So we're basically reading the before and after of the scary scene, but never the actual scene itself. Personally, for me, there's something very scary about leaving some things to the imagination. There was this one scene where a contestant was screaming bloody murder, and two other contestants were hiding nearby. And one of the contestants hiding teared up because they knew that that scream could have only come from someone who was about to die, and they couldn't do anything to help. And that was it. That was the scene. We never get to know exactly what happened, but we know that something happened. And I think that's a frightening and effective way to write a scary scene. I also really like it when stories that have specific situations are peppered with little scenes that make it more believable. Like when the Hunger Games showed all the Girl Scout things that Katniss did in order to survive, and it made sense. There was this one scene where the main character refused to take a bath with soap and shampoo, and they later explained that it was because they didn't wouldn't want their scent tipping anyone off to her location when she's hiding, and I never thought about that. But Kirsten White absolutely did. The next book that I finished in January was That Way Madness Lies, written by various authors and edited by Dahlia Adler. And I give this book 4 stars. That Way Madness Lies is a collection of Shakespeare's works, only retold and reimagined in a more inclusive and diverse lens. This isn't your straightforward kind of retelling. There were some stories that kept it safe and contemporary, but there were definitely some stories that push the boundaries of retelling in terms of concept and genre. Like, never in my entire life would I have imagined a retelling of Much Ado About Nothing as a romantic sci-fi set in a galactic traveling theater. Neither would I have ever imagined a retelling of Julius Caesar as a thriller involving a coven of witches. The authors really pushed the envelope with this collection, paying homage to Shakespeare in creative ways while also challenging the more questionable and harmful rhetoric in his work. And while this book is a retelling, I am of the personal opinion, don't kill me, that you don't necessarily need to have read Shakespeare's works to have a grasp of the story and the themes. A quick Wikipedia search of the original Shakespeare story, I think, would suffice. So Shakespeare's fans, please don't kill me, this is a personal opinion. And the last book that I read in January was A Magic's Teeth in Poison by Judy Lin, which I gave 4 stars. In this book, we follow Ning, who joins this competition to become the official royal tea maker in the hopes of finding a cure for her sister Shu, who has been poisoned. But like any YA fantasy protagonist, Ning is quickly swept up into things that are bigger than her, and she is ensnared in this political warfare that will determine the fate of her sister and the entire kingdom. Now, this was the book that I started in October of last year, and the fact that it took me 3 months to finish it shouldn't be a reflection on the book. It should be a reflection on me. And who is that girl I see staring straight back at me? Someone who will read 5 books simultaneously and not finish a single one. I'm basically a single book mom struggling to make ends meet for her book children.
I'm a survivor.
Now, A Magic's Teeth in Poison is a typical YA fantasy in many areas. It follows a lot of YA tropes and cliches that make it predictable, but it was still an enjoyable read. What I liked the most about the book was its magic system, because it was the first tea-based magic that I ever read about. I enjoyed reading how tea magic worked and how differently it was performed and used depending on where the tea maker was from. I thought that was very interesting. For the most part, I found the characters interesting, but I have a special dislike for the love interest, Kang. Kang is the most boring, whiny, sad boy that no amount of backstory could ever make me sympathize with him. And like many YA fantasies before it, I was not a fan of the romance in this book. The romance between Ning and Kang was a perfect example of a forced and rushed romance without any chemistry between the characters whatsoever. If Ning and Kang's relationship was more of a slow burn, friends to lovers situation, I think I would have tolerated it more. So those were the books that I read in January. Now let's get into the books that I read in February. And the first book that I finished in February was Killers of a Certain Age by Deanna Raybourn, which I gave 4.75 stars. This book is about 4 women who are now in their 60s and have just retired from their affluent careers as assassins. But it turns out that the assassination industry is not as nurturing as it seems when they find out that their own company is trying to dispose of them. What ensues is a game of cat and mouse between this deadly global corporation and 4 elderly, albeit deadlier women. I finished this book in 1 day. 1 day! I finished this book in 1 day! And that is the end of my review. The fact that I missed 3 months to finish a single book, finish this in 1 day, should tell you enough of the quality of this book. But for the sake of the video, I shall expound. Killers of a Certain Age has the pace of a Jason Bourne movie, the thrill of National Treasure, and the drama of an episodes of Real Housewives.
Everybody will know. You understand that? Everybody will know. After my bitch. You know why.
It's fun and never lets up until the very last chapter. Despite the high stakes, it never really feels like there's any actual danger, but that doesn't take away from the anticipation of the events unfolding in the story. So it's thrilling, but it's not stressful, which makes it a perfect weekend read if you ask me. The characters were charming and endearing. It was very easy to fall in love with them and be invested in them. In fact, I was very ready to send a set of nasty subtweets towards the author if any of the characters were harmed. Char, not Char. Deanna Raybourn, I'm looking at you. And like Kirsten White's Hyde, I like that Deanna Raybourn peppered in scenes that made these ladies' backgrounds more believable. Decisions and actions that really sold the fact that these women were veteran assassins. Like that one scene where one character let out a breath of air after diving into the sea so that they could check where the air bubbles would float, thus indicating where the surface was. Or did you know that powdered creamer is highly flammable? Because I didn't, but these ladies did, and they put that knowledge to good use by burning a person. The next book that I finished was We Ride Upon Sticks, written by Quan Barry, and I gave this book 4.75 stars. I knew that I was going to like this book before I picked it up, but I never expected it to become my new favorite book. My new favorite book. Oh, hello, this is my new favorite book. Ano talaga eh? May ganda ako, new favorite book. Gusto ko ipakilala ako new favorite book. I've never been this decisive in my life before, but this is my new favorite book. We Ride Upon Sticks is a charming, humorous story about a field hockey team that sucks so bad they resort to engaging in witchcraft and selling their souls to a dark entity to win and then some. Imagine being so bad at something it makes you desperate enough to sell your soul to the devil. There's so much going on in this book, and all of it is fun. Quan Barry's writing was exceptional, it was captivating, and their humor landed every fucking time. This book is so funny, it's ridiculous. The plot was very interesting because it wasn't the most linear timeline, and it was never really clear who the narrator was. The story is told through a distant first-person point of view, but the characters were addressed by their names, like a third-person POV would. But then there were scenes in the story where the narrator would say, "we said," or "we went." And this made me feel like I was the narrator for some reason. Because the use of the we POV only ever happened when all the characters were in the scene. Because if none of the characters were narrating, the next logical candidate to be the narrator would be the reader. And I don't know why I sound like a conspiracy theorist explaining this, and I'm also not sure if this was the author's intention, but it made my reading experience more immersive and fun. I never really stood a chance with this book because I am always a sucker for friendship stories, and this is one of the most endearing friendship stories that I've read so far. There were some loose ends that weren't wrapped properly, and the ending did feel like a Hallmark movie, thus the 4.75. For the loose ends, I think in hindsight, it was the book's way of emphasizing that at the end of the day, this is a friendship story. The loose ends mostly had something to do with the mysteries and the drama surrounding each character's lives, like who was dating who, and whose parents were about to divorce, and who was stalking girl Corey. But by not giving a definite proper conclusion to these mysteries, I think was the book's way of putting the focus not on these mysteries, but on how the characters reacted to these mysteries and events. Like, I shouldn't care more about who was stalking girl Corey than the fact that her friends did everything in their power to protect her from her stalker. At its core, We Ride Upon Sticks is a story about friendship, and that friendship takes precedence over every other aspect of the story. As for the Hallmark movie ending, I don't have a way to defend that because it was a corny Hallmark ending. But I guess even our favorite stories deserve Hallmark movie endings. And really, these are minute complaints compared to all the praise that I could give this book, because it is my new favorite book, if you didn't know. The next book that I finished was A Venom Dark and Sweet by Judy Lin, which I gave 3 stars. Let's get this over with. I hate it when I start liking out the first book in the series, but get disappointed by the last book of the series. Like, how can the first book slay that hard, but the second book be absolutely meh? Venom Dark and Sweet is the sequel to A Magic Steeped in Poison and the conclusion to the Book of Tea duology. In this book, we follow Ning as she escapes with Princess Jen, Jen's bodyguard and lover, Rui, and Ning's newly healed sister Shu as they go on an adventure to accomplish some tasks in the hope of saving the kingdom, blah blah blah. I can't even pretend to be interested in this, and I know that I'm complaining a lot for a person who gave this book 3 stars, but I do not care. My first complaint about this book was that there wasn't enough of the girl gang than I expected. The synopsis made it sound like these girls will be together for most of the story. And to be quite frank, the only reason I picked this series up in the first place was because I was excited to read about an all-girls road trip in the second book. So imagine my disappointment when by the second half of the book, they all split up so that Ning could pull a Gabriela Montez and go her own way. My second complaint is about the magic system. Look, I still found it interesting, but I felt like it took way too much liberty in this book that it sometimes felt illogical. There was literally one scene where Ning used her tea magic on soup. On soup. As in sabaw. Watch Ning put the tea in tinola, the sin in sinigang. And my last and biggest complaint is everyone's favorite sad boy, Kang. Now sit down, class, because this is gonna take a long time. Now in this book, we follow 2 perspectives, Ning's and Kang's. And that's my first problem here, because if the purpose of Kang's perspective was to make us understand and sympathize with his situation, then maybe we should have been given his perspective in the first book. Kang's perspective in this book was so sudden that it made his voice and backstory seem very forced, like his daddy issues were constantly being shoved down my throat. Now, I cannot talk about my problem with Kang without bringing up Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's going to make sense, I promise. Now, Zuko and Kang's arcs have similarities. We perceive them as antagonists who are morally ambiguous until they develop into this protagonist that we can root for. In Avatar, we follow Zuko from the very start. We see him as this angry antagonist wanting the approval of his father at all costs, to this confused, scared runaway who doesn't know what to do, to this prince who is at odds with his own morality while still wanting the favor of his father, to finally becoming his own person and standing for what is right and what he believes in, even if it means going against his own father. It is, without question, one of the best character developments in the whole of fiction. It's easy to root for Zuko because we see him in every defining moment of his life. We see his principles and beliefs and struggles being questioned and challenged until he finally becomes Zuko that we see by the end of the show. We do not get that with Kang. Kang's backstories are fed to us through conversation, and when we finally do get his perspective, Kang is already at Zuko's at odds with morality phase. We never get to see how Kang got there. And to be frank, there was never really an inner turmoil with Kang, because up until the end, he was still willing to die on the hill that his father was just a pawn instead of a direct player in a political warfare that hurt countless of people. In fact, we never even get to see Kang grapple with the fact that the Brotherhood he's known since childhood is the same group that has terrorized villages for years. Kang was stuck in this place of being complicit but not fully accepting accountability, while also whining about morality the entire time, and it was such a huge turnoff. And the worst thing is, when the book ends, Kang never has to face the consequences of his involvement and his actions. The fact that he felt guilty a few times here and there apparently was enough to absolve him of participating in his father's plans. This was a guy who actively participated and followed his father's orders that contributed to harming and even killing a number of people. But sure, he felt guilty, so he's fine. I've already spent a lot of time bad-mouthing this book, so my last complaints would be that the climactic battle scene was very boring, and that Wenyu should have been a main character next to Ning. I still give this book 3 stars because I enjoyed Judy Lin's writing. I still found most of the characters endearing, and all of the scenes through Ning's perspectives were actually interesting to follow. Okay, the next book that I read was Hide and Seeker by Daka Herman, which I gave 4 stars. Hide and Seeker is a middle grade horror following a group of children who are being hunted by this dark entity after playing a game of hide and seek. Now, middle grade horror should have no business being this scary. I was avoiding reading this book at night because whether you were 13 or 30, Daka Herman didn't care. They wrote to scare. The characters in this book were very intuitive and thoughtful. I thought Daka Herman portrayed how young characters react to heavy and sensitive situations pretty well. This book deals with the disappearances of children, the loss of a loved one, anxiety and PTSD, and other family issues, and the way that the characters worked with or around these issues didn't feel patronizing, it didn't feel sanitized. These characters felt like actual human beings processing all these thoughts and emotions and events. I also really liked how the story emphasized the importance of friendship up until the end by emphasizing that it doesn't take just one person to save the day. I really hate it, especially in YA books, when we have this group of characters working towards a common goal, but it's only ever really the main character who has any real impact on the story. In Hide and Seeker, every kid is given a chance to shine and contribute to saving the day. No one's effort is diminished or ever compared to each other. Each kid has their own struggle and their own victories, and each one of them is celebrated. The next book that I read was Sorrowland by River Solomon, and I didn't give this book a rating. Sorrowland is a gothic horror following Vern, 15 years old and pregnant, as she escapes the black separatist cult that she grew up in and into the wilderness of the forest. There she gives birth to twins and raises them away from the influence of the outside world. But soon enough, the cult catches up to her, and her past summons a change in her body that transcends physical understanding. This was my first River Solomon book, and I found fair writing very captivating. This is definitely a book that you should get into with some preparation because it demands your entire attention. I didn't give this book a rating because first, I wouldn't even know what rating to give it. And second, I didn't feel comfortable giving it a rating when I wasn't able to grasp all of the nuances of the story. I'm not going to pretend that I'm smart and say that I understood what the book wanted to say, because most of the time I had to look up reviews by Black reviewers to see what points I've missed about the story and the characters. I didn't even know Vern was intersex until I read a review. There was also the fact that throughout the story, I read Vern's experiences thinking that she was a young adult, like 20 years old at least, because of the maturity with which she handled things and because of the time skips in the book, only to be harshly reminded that even by the end of the book, Vern is only 19 years old. The things I interpreted as Vern being mature weren't the actions of an adult, but the actions of a teenager trying to survive. And I think how I read this book is a reflection on how young Black people, both in fiction and in real life, are oftentimes treated and perceived as more mature or older than their age. Sorrowland deals with the mistreatment and disrespect of Black bodies and identities in America, and it was clear that River Solomon didn't write this book to pander to any non-Black demographic, but rather to give weight to Vern's story as a Black character. The next book that I read was We Deserve Monuments by Jess Hammonds, which I gave 4 stars. This book follows Avery, who moves into a small town with her family to take care of her dying grandmother, Mama Letty. Upon arriving, it becomes clear very fast that there is some resentment between her mother and Mama Letty, an emotional turmoil that takes root in the dark secrets that her family and the town is keeping. This is a story about family, friendship, generational trauma, queer identity, racism, and police brutality. And for a YA book that deals with heavy and sensitive topics such as these, Jess Hammonds did a really great job in making the story accessible to consume, but not sugarcoating anything. The story tackles its themes thoughtfully but head-on. The book also doesn't shy away from adding complexity to the emotional elements of its story, like how Avery's friendship with Simone and Jade was handled. Jas Hammonds was able to portray the multitude of colors that a friendship has, how things can get complicated even with the people that we're closest with. But the standout of the book was definitely the relationship between Avery, her mother, and her grandmother. I liked how the topic of generational trauma was handled with such care in the story, and how Avery was challenged when she belittled her mother's trauma without knowing the full scope of it. We also get to see the other spectrum of this topic, which was Mama Letty taking responsibility and accountability for the emotional abuse that she put her daughter through and asking forgiveness for it. It's a book that treats its story's emotional elements with the gravity it deserves. And the last book that I read in February was The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, which I gave 4 stars. I pressed pause on cozy mysteries back in 2021 after I read Arsenic and Adobo. I've read a couple of cozy mysteries before it, but Arsenic and Adobo just really turned me off from the genre for a quick minute. It was so popular at the time, and I thought that if Arsenic and Adobo is the figurehead of cozy mysteries, then I don't think there's much in the genre for me. So I was apprehensive when I picked this book up because there's only so much disappointment I can take in life. I'm already a disappointment to myself. There's no need to add more. But after reading this, I realized I do not dislike cozy mysteries. Arsenic and Adobo was just a really bad book. Set in a charming retirement village, The Thursday Murder Club follows 4 elderly pensioners whose knack for investigating unsolved murders is put to the test when someone is murdered in their quaint little town. The book features an endearing cast of characters, each with their own humor and history to add to the story. In fact, I don't think it would be too far off to say that The Thursday Murder Club is like Ocean's 11, but with old people. I also greatly enjoyed the story and the mystery. If you've read Agatha Christie or Arthur Conan Doyle, you'll be familiar with how English mystery writers tend to take their time with their stories, but I find that absolutely enjoyable, and each scene contributes to building up either the story or the character, so Richard Osman knows how to use his time well. The mystery is rich, it's complex and complicated and layered. Richard Osman knows how to constantly misdirect me, but my most favorite part about the book was its humor. It was dry, it was snappy, it was thoughtful, and it landed every time. It was unassuming, but in a very adorable way. My only complaint with this book was its questionable portrayal of Constable Donna De Freitas, who was the only black character. There were a couple of scenes that made me uncomfortable, specifically when it was revealed that there was an incident where Donna apprehended a person a bit more harshly than usual just because she was in a bad mood. With the ongoing problem of police brutality against black people, you can understand why portraying a black police officer roughing up another person because they were in a bad mood isn't a good look. All in all, The Thursday Murder Club is a fun and charming read for when you want to enjoy yourself in the company of endearing fictional characters. And that is it for all the books that I read in January and February. I'm really happy that I got to do a wrap-up that isn't a yearly thing, and I'm hoping my video posting would be just as productive as my reading nowadays. So let's hope for that. And that is it for this video. Bye!